Good morning. I'll go ahead and apologize. I will likely have to take a few drinks of water. I don't know what it is when we come back from out towards Rome and we get back to northeast Texas, the different allergens, they get me every time. Something about it, but it's got my throat just a little bit dry, so bear with me. But this morning, if you're expecting a Father's Day lesson, I'm sorry to say I do not have one of those prepared. Originally, I was going to be here next weekend, but it worked out so much better for our traveling that Pete was kind enough to let me go ahead and come in this weekend and do my lesson. So I'm real thankful for Preston and doing that for me. But we're actually going to be looking at a lesson on love. And oftentimes when you consider love, it's almost as if we think, well, you know what, we already have a good understanding of love. You know, it's one of those things where sometimes we're like, really, another lesson on love? But when you really think about it, what it means to love biblically, how do you measure up? When you consider love, how important is it to you? We're going to look at some texts that I think will very much make it very clear how important love is to Jesus and what it means to truly love as a Christian should love. Look, if you will, to Mark chapter 12. Mark chapter 12. In verse 28, what you find is a situation where Jesus is questioned by a scribe, and ultimately what he's going to do is he is going to summarize the law. And you see in the verses following, in verse 29, he says, in Jesus' response. Now these are two texts that he pulled from Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 5, Leviticus chapter 19 and verse 18. So he goes directly to the Old Testament. And he's going to answer the question that's been brought before him. And Jesus says, love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, with all of your mind, and with all of your strength. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these. Now, this scribe, seeing that Jesus answered wisely, he says, well said, teacher. You have spoken the truth, for there is one God, and there is no other but He. And to love Him with all of your heart and with all understanding, with all of your soul and with all strength, and to love one's neighbor as oneself is more important than all the whole burnt offerings and sacrifices. Now Jesus, perceiving he answered wisely, says to him, you are not far from the kingdom of God. Now when you consider the question that was brought before Jesus and the answer that he gives, essentially you could say he lays out two tables of law. One being that of my relationship and how I'm supposed to love the Lord my God, my relationship between me and him. The second being that with my relationship with my fellow man and the love that I am to express to all men. In Matthew's account, it also says that all the prophets and all the commandments stand on these. They could all hang on these two. Therefore, it should produce something in us that these two laws, if we truly focus on these and we truly work on these, everything else should be able to kind of fall into place. If everything else can hang upon these two. Now, the part that is often overlooked, when you consider what the scribe responded to Jesus, and I'm going to read it one more time. He says to love one's neighbor as oneself is more than all the whole burnt offerings and sacrifices. And he says, well said, essentially, you're not far from the kingdom of God. Do you hear what he's saying in that text? Almost as if he's saying our relationship with other people, how we treat other people is almost more to God than our worship. Let that sink in for just a moment. And consider even at times where in the past maybe our worship hasn't been what it should be. Maybe our relations with other people are not what they should be. He's saying you should love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus is not belittling nor diminishing the necessity and the need for us to worship our God. But what he is doing is saying, look, what good is it if you're going to worship scripturally, but you live your life unscripturally? Amen. If you love the Lord your God, but you do not love man, you're truly not loving the Lord your God. This should produce something in us that causes us to love as Christ would have us to love. Now, again, I'll ask, what is your thought on love? How important is love to you in loving your fellow man? It should be extremely important. But then you have to consider, what does it mean to love biblically? Do you ever consider truly what it means to love as the Bible would show us to love? And consider your everyday relations that you have at work or at home or at wherever it might be, even during, say, whatever hobbies you might have and the people that you see on a regular basis. Do you often consider, do I love as the Bible says that I am to love? Let's go to 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians chapter 13. But now I want to discuss just a little bit as far as what's going on in the context of this particular chapter. The chapter previously, chapter 12, at the very beginning in the first half is given a description of all the different spiritual gifts that were able to be received. And he's saying all of these gifts, these are the different ones, and there's explanation given of them. And then in the latter part of chapter 12, he says, now this is the connection. They all tie back to the building up of the church. And then when we go into chapter 13, you see the motivation that should be behind all of these gifts. Love. Chapter 14, essentially saying this is what happens if you put these spiritual gifts together that you have been blessed with, and the key verse being to build up the church. Paul is focusing in on love with a situation that's happening at Corinth. You think about the Corinthian brethren, what was their problem as it related to these spiritual gifts? They saw some as if they were better than others. They desired them. They were jealous. They were envious of some of the spiritual gifts that some of the other people had. And in their mind, they held that of speaking in tongues in high regard in comparison to any other. What did Paul hold in high regard in comparison? Prophecy. I want you to look at the text as we go through this text, and I want you to really pay attention to what is said about love and what is said about these gifts. And we're going to compare those even to our lives today. 1 Corinthians chapter 12, let's start at verse 31. But earnestly desire the best gifts, and yet I show you a more excellent way. Now, this earnestly is to be zealous. It is to be jealous. The word actually is envious. The same word, we'll see it again here in a moment in another text that we're going to look at, is the same word in both of these texts that we'll look at. Envious. He says you are envious of the best gifts. They had the ones that they held to high esteem, and they wanted them for themselves, not for the glory of God. Now, you move into the next part of the text. It says, I show you a more excellent way. Essentially, what Paul is saying in a more excellent way, the road, or the way, meaning basically a way, a road, or a way of traveling. That's the Greek terminology, but you could also consider it as a course of behavior. He says, let me show you a better course of behavior. Let me show you a better way, or even a better instruction to be considering. He says, I have something better for you. Essentially, when you consider the next three verses, Paul's got their attention. What was their problem? They looked to tongues as if it was something better than everything else, and they desired it not out of love. They desired it because they were envious, because they wanted it to be able to elevate themselves. Now, in the next three verses, the Apostle Paul is going to give some hypotheticals. He's going to give some hypotheticals, then he's going to subtract love from the situation, and then he's going to give the result of what it is. He's really fixing to grab their attention, and I think if we're honest with ourselves, he's fixing to probably really grab ours when we go into these next verses. 1 Corinthians chapter 13 and verse 1. Though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, but I have not love, I have become but sounding brass or clanging cymbal. You recognize that the Apostle Paul does not see himself as better than this situation. You recognize the language, first person singular, I, the Apostle Paul. If I myself speak with the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I'm just clanging brass, just a noise. He had these gifts just the same as they had these gifts. And he puts himself into this situation so that they can actually better understand it. And he says basically, if your motive is not that of love, you're just making noise. Now you consider that, if you think about that, even in a preacher's standpoint, or consider that even in your own life as it relates to evangelism. Look, you can wax eloquently the Word of God. You can scream, you can holler, you can pound on the pulpit, but if your motivation is not love, you're going to lose souls. Your people will recognize that your motivation is not out of love. Our motivation should be driven by love. The Apostle Paul says if you're not loving, you're just making noise. You're just clanging brass. Now, even as we discuss the spiritual gift that the Corinthians saw to be that of the greatest, tongues. So where did the Apostle Paul go first? Speaking in tongues. Consider where he's going to go next. 1 Corinthians chapter 13 and verse 2. And though I have the gift of prophecy and understanding of all mystery and knowledge, And though I have faith so as to remove mountains, but I have not love, I am nothing. Essentially, what Paul did was take their number one, speaking in tongues. Now he says that which is even better, being able to prophesy. He says, even if I have the two of these, but I have not love, I am nothing yet again. And even if I understand all mystery and knowledge, which he did not completely. Verse 9 in the same chapter says, we know in part, we prophesy in part. Verse 12 says, for we see in a mirror dimly. Yes, he had a revelation. He had understanding of a very large amount, but he didn't fully understand it completely. But he said, even if I have not love, I'm nothing. He goes on to say, if I can remove mountains, possibly speaking metaphorically, but you cannot help but to think about Matthew chapter 17 and verse 20. Talking about that faith that is so great that you could actually move mountains. He says, even if I have that kind of faith, but I have not love, I am nothing. And now he's going to take it to actions of behavior. And this one right here is one that we would probably consider an ultimate expression of our faith. You look at verse 3. He says, and though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned, but I have not love, it profits me nothing. To feed the poor. Doing that which the rich man would not do, the rich young ruler in Matthew chapter 19, verses 21 and 22. He asked, what must I do to receive the kingdom? What must I do to be able to take part of that? And he says, one thing you lack. One thing you lack, sell all that you have and give to the poor. And he went away with tears in his eyes because he was not willing. This thing, that which he lacked, he says, even if I do that, be willing to give all of my belongings to the poor, give everything that I have, and even to give his body to be burned. This one's interesting. He says, even if I give my body to be burned. Essentially, he is saying, I can go from the flames of martyrdom to the flames of hell. Let that sink in for a minute. To give my body to be burned. Why? How could that be possible? You think about that, that should absolutely terrify us because of the wrong motive. If I have the mindset of I'm going to do something because I'm going to show them, I'll show them how much faith I have, I'll show them, rather than doing it out of love. To receive some sort of praise by men, the wrong motive. You think about Acts chapter 5, Ananias and Sapphira. What was the problem? They had saw what Barnabas had done. They saw that he had taken a piece of property that he had. He took and he sold that property and gave all of the proceeds to the apostles to give to the poor, to give to those who were less fortunate. They saw something in that, possibly the praise that he received. Not sure. Whatever it was, it drove them by motivation to do it because they wanted to be seen by men. They went and they took the money that they had received. They said they had sold it for this much. Said, yes, we're giving you every bit of that, and they were lying. And they were struck dead there in their tracks. If my motivation is not in the proper place, it profits me absolutely nothing. On the other hand, the flip side of that coin, you consider Christ. You consider what the Apostle Paul said about Christ. He says, who loved me and gave his life for me, Galatians chapter 2 and verse 20. What's his motivation? Love. You consider John chapter 3 and verse 16. We know that one. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. What was the motivation? Love. The reality of this text is that I could die a martyr's death and go straight to hell if my motivation is not out of love. If I say, well, I'm going to stick it to them. If I have that kind of mindset about it, my motivation is wrong. It should be done out of love. Paul is writing by inspiration on this matter, and it should really make us think about how important love is in our lives, and do we truly love as Christ would have us to love? Because the Apostle Paul is saying, look, it does not matter how gifted you are. It does not matter how smart you are. It does not matter how many languages you speak. If you have not love, it is nothing. That's a difficult passage. Now we're fixing to look at what it means to love biblically. We're going to look at what it says in the text, and I want you to realize from the next several verses that we're fixing to look at, as it describes love, these are not adjectives. These are verbs. This is what love looks like in action as we live it out in our lives and we show it to other people, what the love of Christ actually looks at. Look at chapter 13 and verse 4 of 1 Corinthians. It says, love suffers long and is kind. Love does not envy. Love does not parade itself, and it is not puffed up. You consider this thought of love suffers long, and there's really two definitions that you could glean from this. To remain tranquil while in a situation that is trying to push you to be impatient. Basically, being patient, a situational type of patience that we might have. The other being that to bear up under provocation without complaint, to be patient, even if being provoked. And believe me, people will provoke us to anger. But it says love suffers long. How patient are you with others? How patient are you with the faults of others? How patient are you with the spiritual immaturity of others? You know, you could say that you possibly have studied with someone. I know I've been there before. You study with someone on a particular topic and you study it for weeks, and they cannot seem to grasp what you're trying to get across to them. They cannot seem to grasp what it is that the text is saying, and what happens to us in that situation. All of a sudden, the suffering long kind of runs out the door, doesn't it? The Apostle Paul says, love suffers long. What about if somebody continues to make the same mistake again and again? Or we get irritated with the situation. Though they come to us and they ask forgiveness and they're genuine, we begin to get irritated and we may say things like, I just can't believe it. We start shaking our heads and shaking our fingers at them, acting as if we've never made the same mistake twice in our lives. Love suffers long. And Peter asked Jesus, he said, how many times should I forgive my brother? How many times should I forgive my fellow man? 7 times? 70 times 7, Matthew chapter 18, verses 21 and 22. It's like we think people should be able to hear something one time, automatically apply it to their lives, and all of a sudden be a perfectionist on that matter, and when they do not. It's almost like we start to pull our hair out and say, come on, get it together. Who in here has it together completely? Who in here is perfect? He says, love suffers long. We say, well, I'm just growing impatient with him and I want to see change. Guess what? God calls it unloving. If you want to call things by Bible names, take that to its full extent. Love suffers long. You see, this does not only apply as it relates to brethren in our conversations with each other or our relations with each other, but this also applies outside of the walls of this assembly. It applies out into the workforce. It applies in my home. Let me tell you something. If I am the most patient individual as it relates to my workplace, as it relates to my hobbies, as it relates to inside these 4 walls, but I am not patient at my home, I'm failing miserably. Amen. Love suffers long. He goes on and he says, love is kind. Tertullian, one of the early church fathers, said this. He said the pagans knew the Christians for their mildness and for their meekness. One writer said this about kindness. He said, kindness is and always will be one of the most beautiful and powerful forces for good that exists in this whole world. And then he describes kindness as this. Kindness is the sincere and voluntary use of one's time, talent, resources to better the lives of others. Here's a question. Do you actively seek to better the lives of others, or do you continually drag them down by your negativity and your ill behavior towards them? He says, love is kind. Some people would say, well, you know what? Sometimes I just get fed up. Sometimes I get tired of this. Well, even as we just mentioned, those of the early first century were known for their mildness. They were known for their meekness. Though we may find ourselves in a situation where all of a sudden we are tried a little bit, our patience is tried a little bit, and all of a sudden we let that go right out the window. The Bible would call us unkind, therefore unloving. You ever known anybody who's said to be one of those who never hold back punches? They just tell it like it is. The Bible would call that unloving. It's a hard topic when you start to consider some of the things that we are expected to do in our lives. It's not an easy thing to truly love biblically, but it's something that we are commanded to do. Let's say you find yourself in a situation where someone is short and gruff with you. Do you immediately return the same behavior? Or say you go to a hotel, say it's one of those that actually has the bellboys. I'm sure we don't get to go those often. You know, they come out to your car and they actually load up all of your luggage right there at your vehicle. They take it in, they take it to the elevator, they take it all the way up to your room, then they unload it for you. Would you be one of those that pulled the little Macaulay Culkin Home Alone, hand him some bubble gum? Then the next time he comes up and he helps you, you say you need another tip, and he says, oh, I still have some of that gum, just to flash a little money to rub it in their face. Let's say you go to a restaurant and you're eating and there is a waitress who is waiting on your table who seems if she cannot get it together. She cannot stay focused. She's messing up the order. She messed up the drink order. She messed up the food order. Do you immediately turn and say, well, she's not getting a tip? You know absolutely nothing about her life. How do you know that she is not at home by herself because her husband left? She's trying to raise 2 kids on her own, hoping she has enough money to pay the babysitter, only to go home, put her kids to bed, pray with them, and cry herself to sleep. And since when has returning evil for evil ever been okay for a Christian? Kindness is becoming a lost art in the world that we live in. I think everybody would agree in that. But let me tell you something, it's becoming a lost art among some brethren. The Apostle Paul says love is kind. Colossians chapter 3 and verse 12 says, therefore, as the elect of God, as God's chosen, as His chosen generation, as those who have put on Christ, holy and beloved, put on tender mercies, kindness, humility, meekness, and long-suffering. He goes on to say, love does not envy. Here's where I was telling you earlier, we're going to look at the same word. This same word for envy is the same word in the Greek language that was used before when it's talking about that zealous or jealous. Remember, they were envious of these other spiritual gifts. He says love does not envy, directly pointing towards what they were doing. The Corinthians had envied these spiritual gifts that they thought were better. Have you ever envied anybody or anything in this life? Let's say you have you work somewhere where there is a job promotion available. And you know for a fact that you are better qualified. You know that you put in more time, more work than anybody else. You know that position should be yours, and then somebody else gets it. What's your first thought? How about this? Let's say that person then does something to ruin their good name and smear their good name and lose that job. What do you think then? Now, I'm sure as Christians we wouldn't say, oh, it serves them right. But would you think it? Love is very challenging. Love is a very challenging topic. Love does not parade itself around, is not puffed up, literally meaning to heap praise on oneself. Someone who continually adds in information to make themselves sound better in front of other men. The puffed up, we may think of somebody that has a big head, right? Somebody who's arrogant. An inflated sense of self. Here's a question. Do you think that you're better than anybody else? Really think about that one. I would think that none of us would say, yes, I'm better than anybody else, right? What's your first thought when you see someone who is openly homosexual, what we would call flaming gay? We are to love the soul, hate the sin, but we are to love the soul. What's your first thought? What's your first thought when you see a drunk who is drowning in the depths of a bottle, or a drug addict who is continuing to fall back into the same problems that he always has, ruining his family, destroying his home, what's your first thought then? Do you feel like you're better than that person? What's your first thought when you see a homeless man begging for some spare change? Don't get me wrong, a lot of people get themselves into the situations that they may find themselves in. But we are not to feel as if we are better than anyone. We are all those who need the blood of Christ to cleanse us so that we can have that reward we desire. Here's one that's a little bit more maybe to our style. What do you think about someone who walks into service occasionally? They do not attend as often as you might. Do you feel like you're better than that person? Have you ever met somebody who is a topper? You know, the mentality of, I've done it better. It doesn't matter what you have done. It doesn't matter how good you did it. They're going to be one of those who has done it better. They've done it more times. They've been a lot more prosperous at it than anything that you have ever done. They're a topper. The mentality that carries with this, as far as it relates to Christianity, is all of a sudden they may be saying, well, look at how many baptisms I have had. Look at how many studies that I have had. Look at all that I have done. And eventually you have to stop and say, what has Christ done in that? Because it's all about them. Because it's all the focus is on them. The Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 3 and verse 6 says, I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the increase. So then neither the one who plants is anything, nor he who waters, but God gives the increase. Let us keep the right mindset of who we are in comparison to our fellow man. Verse 5, it says, it does not behave rudely, does not seek its own, is not provoked, and thinks no evil. I tell you what, and I've said this before, one of the biggest shocks to me when we went up to the Dallas-Fort Worth area was the traffic. I really am tried on my patience as it relates to the traffic in the DFW area. People will cut you off. People will push you right over into other traffic if they have to get onto the road. Almost as if they don't care about you. Get out of my way. We find ourselves in that situation where all of a sudden we might start screaming things in our vehicle. We think, well, they can't hear us. God can. Maybe we throw up some hand gestures that maybe we shouldn't. God sees it. Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 4 says, neither filthiness, nor foolish talking, nor coarse jesting, which are not fitting, but rather giving thanks. What comes out of our mouth should uplift other people. It should help other people grow closer to God, not tear down nor cut down, but rather those things which are pleasant. It says, does not seek its own. There are those who seek only things because of their own interest, very selfish in nature. As it relates, if you think in terms of doctrine, there are those who at times think, you know what, if you don't believe exactly what I believe on every single topic, you're a heretic. And they'll disfellowship you. Even if it is not a topic that is a fellowship matter. And they call that standing on the truth. God calls it unloving. Is not provoked. Am I a person who is difficult to get along with? Am I a person who is constantly ill-tempered? Do I get irritated easily at others? You know, maybe I've had a difficult day. Maybe things have been tough for a week or two or a month or even longer. It doesn't give me right to be ugly to other people, to be disrespectful to other people. Is not provoked, thinks no evil. What is the first thing that you think when a weaker brother misses a service? Do you immediately think, you know what, I'm sure they were doing this or that last night. That's why they're not here. The very word for think means to count, to think, or to calculate. And oftentimes it seems as if we immediately begin to calculate, I wonder what they were doing last night, the reason they ain't here today. Rather than having the mindset saying, you know what, maybe I ought to call them. I wonder if they're okay. Maybe something happened. Thinks no evil. Some translations here may say is not resentful. Someone who says they forgive someone, yet they hold on to it and they hold that wrongdoing over their head for hope that they can pile that back on them at any given time in their life. Maybe refuses to see how much growth is in that person, and rather to rejoice in that growth, they'll continue to hold that something over their head as long as they possibly can. Resentful. Now watch what we see in the next verse, and that thought carries over into verse 6. Does not rejoice in iniquity, but rejoices in truth. Have you ever known someone, even in that same situation, who will not let go of something like that? Who continues to hold on to it only for the opportunity when it comes, if it arises, to say, I told you so. Does not rejoice in iniquity, rejoices in truth. Essentially, doing something like that is rejoicing in iniquity. Waiting for the opportunity to say, I told you so. 1 Corinthians chapter 13 and verse 7 says, bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Bears all things. Somebody comes to you with something in confidence, do you immediately go tell it to 3 or 4 other people saying, shh, don't say nothing about that? Believes all things. Do you constantly think the best in people or the worst in people? Hopes all things, hoping for the best in all things. And if we do all of this, put all of the puzzle together, it says it endures all things. Verse 8, it says love never fails. Essentially, love will not fall flat if you put all the pieces together in love as Christ would have us to love. Now, who is supposed to receive this love that we have been discussing? Everybody. Christians, our fellow man. Everyone is to receive that love. If you want to prevail spiritually, love biblically. 1 Corinthians 13 and verse 13 says, and now abide faith, hope, and love. These 3, the greatest of these is love. Chapter 14 and verse 1, pursue love. Make that your goal. Make that your desire to pursue biblical love and show it to other people in your life. Live biblically as it relates even to love. And know for a fact that when you walk outside of these 4 walls and you go out to your workplace, when you go into the grocery store, you will never look another person in the eyes who God does not love and loves just as much as he loves you. How good are you at loving biblically? I told you it's a tough one. I look at myself and I say, man, I need a lot of work. This is really challenging, but the expectation is that we love by this standard that has been set before us. Let me give you one last thing before we close. This is what was written about Christians in AD 130. It says, they love all men and are persecuted by all. They are unknown and condemned. They are put to death and restored to life. They are poor, yet make many rich. They are in lack of all things, yet abound in all. They are dishonored, yet their very dishonor are glorified. They are evil spoken of, and yet are justified. They are reviled, but yet blessed. They are insulted, and repay the insult with honor. They do good, yet are punished as evildoers. When punished, they rejoice as if quickened into life. They are assailed by the Jews as foreigners and are persecuted by the Greeks. Yet those who hate them are unnameable to assign any reason for their hatred. To sum it up in a few words, what the soul is to the body, Christians are to this world. How do you measure up in comparison? This is a difficult one. It's challenging. This is one where if we are honest with ourselves, we probably fell short fairly often. I know that it's very often at times I find myself failing in places that we just discussed. It's easy to do. It takes a whole lot of effort. It takes a whole lot of want to be able to love as the Bible would have us to love, but that expectation is placed upon us. How do you find yourself today? If you have problems in your life, make those corrections today. You have brothers and sisters here who would love to hug your neck. They would love to pray for you. I'm sure they would even continue to call you through the week just to check on you. If you've not yet put on Christ in baptism, let's do that today. If you're of accountable age and you know what the Bible teaches about baptism, let's discuss it furthermore. If you have any problem in your life today as it relates to loving your God, and as it relates to loving your brother. Please let it be known as together we stand as we sing.